Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Saintliness seminars at Notre Dame, run by the World Religions World Church program. Good to see everyone for session number 3. We're dealing with saintliness in Islam especially, and I'm really looking forward to our presentations. We'll try to keep the introductions brief, so we have time not only for the presentations, but for some question and answer. So please be prepared to engage with our speakers. Just some regular etiquette reminders for Zoom. If you can kindly remember to be muted during the presentations and then to unmute when you want to speak, and then mute again. And one reminder which I sent out by email this morning, that the presentations for the first 2 sessions are now available at the Notre Dame Theology YouTube channel. If you need to find that, just the keyword ND Theo, one word, if you put that in to the YouTube search bar, you should come up with the right website. We're really grateful to have been building a community of scholars and friends who are interested in the theme of saintliness that we're exploring together across traditions. This is only session 3, so we have 6 more sessions to come. Please don't hesitate to spread the word to friends and colleagues. The more, the merrier. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker, who is Martino Diaz. I've asked the speakers, all of them, to speak for about 20 minutes, so we have between 6 to 8 minutes of questions afterwards. Martino, just to prepare myself, do you have a PowerPoint?
Yes. Could you?
Okay, so I will make you a co-host here as I introduce you. Martino Diaz is Associate Professor of Arabic Language and Literature at the Catholic University of Milan. And from January to July 2019, he was a visiting member at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, the School of Historical Studies. He graduated in Oriental Languages and Civilizations from the University of Venice, where he earned his PhD in 2007 in Oriental Studies. He has many publications. I'll mention just 2. He is the author of the Introduction to Arabic Origins, History, and Present in Italian, Introduzione alla Lingua Araba, that was published in a 2nd edition in 2018, which attests to the success of the 2012 first edition. And he is the translator of Abu al-Ala al-Ma'ari's letter on forgiveness, again in Italian, L'Epistola del Perdono. And he's a wonderful friend and colleague who I've had the pleasure of collaborating with and getting to know on different occasions. He's going to speak to us today on Milestones of Saintliness in Islam, a journey in 4 stages.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for this presentation. I'm going to start with a PowerPoint. Just a moment.
Hey, Paul, can you, it's not giving me the authority to make him co-host because you're host since you logged on first. Can you do that? Just click on more there.
Can I now try maybe?
You should be able to do it now.
Yes, yes.
Sorry.
So share. Okay. Just a moment, I move here. And here I am, I hope. Can you see now the PowerPoint? Okay, so saintliness is an elusive matter, probably the most elusive of all. Once Cardinal Scola, the founder of the Oasis Foundation, told me that saintliness is the only reality in the world that really escapes the grip of power and politics. So elusive it is that I had originally planned to present to you, as my former title goes, a journey in 4 stages along the path or tariqa that leads towards God. To my surprise, however, the subject soon exploded, as though animated by the interior dynamics, and it largely surpassed the time allotted to humans for oral presentations, let alone virtual ones. After some hesitation, I have chosen to present you the first 2 stages of the path, reaching what I hope is a significant, though non-definitive conclusion. I would characterize it as a good panoramic viewpoint along the road to the summit. And I leave the other two stages probably, perhaps, for the workshop next September, inshallah. Well, when I first started thinking about the subject of this conference, I was busy, and unfortunately I still am, with a critical edition of a universal chronography by the Copt Arab historian Al-Makin, 13th century. Most of his work is a summary of the historical books of the Old Testament, and therefore it must be checked against this text. While duly taking my refresher course in the Bible, I was struck by some references to the sons of the prophets in the cycle of Elisha. Here you can see it in Arabic, Banu el-Anbiya, the sons of the prophets. The term in Hebrew, Bnei Hanabiyim, occurs 11 times in the Hebrew Bible in special connection with Elisha. These sons of the prophets appear to have been quite numerous during Elisha's days in Israel and to have formed prophetic guilds. We find mentions of a community in Bethel, Gilgal, Ephraim, Jericho, where 50 of them follow Elijah and Elisha until the ford of the Jordan. Most notable is the fact that these sons of the prophets had embraced a communitarian way of life. Although the texts do not mention it explicitly, these sons of the prophets may also have practiced music in continuity with similar scenes described in the first book of Samuel, and going back to the epoch of Saul, you will meet a band of prophets coming down from the shrine with harp, tambourine, flute, and lyre, playing in front of them. They will be in a prophetic frenzy. From the passages in 2 Kings, we can also infer that they recognize a master over them, in this case, Elisha himself, whom they acknowledge as Elijah's legitimate heir. They usually sought the master approval before taking action, although they could also act independently. And there are scattered references to these communities later also, for example, in Jeremiah's lifetime and in Amos' autobiography, where he states, "I am no prophet nor a prophet's son." So by contrast. Anyone who is familiar with the Muslim tradition of saintliness, and there are many in this audience, will not have missed the remarkable similarities to the so-called Sufi orders. On a mere phenomenological plane, Sufis too trace their origin to the prophetic movement, lead a communitarian life, are structured in guilds, with a master or sheikh at their head, possess specific meeting places. Their alleged wonders are of a very popular nature, in tune with the short episodes from the Bible featuring the sons of the prophets and which revolve around healings, things lost and recovered, food and poison. And music, obviously, plays a very important role in their ceremonies. If we move to the level of doctrine, there too we can find many similarities. In the Old Testament, the cycle of Elisha occurs at a stage when revelation is almost exclusively focused on monotheism and the fight against idolatry. This is particularly apparent in an episode from the book of Kings, where Elisha sends again a son of the prophets to anoint Jehu. And through terrible bloodshed, Jehu will bring about the fall of Ahab and his syncretistic project, while also carrying out the massacre of the prophets of Baal and their faithful in an uncompromising fight to uproot idolatry from the house of Israel. In many instances, though, the sons of the prophets appear to possess only a vague understanding of religious matters. And Elisha's servant Gehazi is a good case in point. When Naaman the Syrian is healed, he attempts to make money out of the miracle, only to be punished with leprosy. Given their ambiguous nature, the biblical sons of the prophets could be perhaps dubbed as Israel's communitarian experts of the sacred. Their understanding of religion is real but limited, and they are always tempted by personal profit. Yet as long as they remain faithful to the directives of their master Elisha, they can perform some good. keeping alive the faith of the people of Israel in the one God of the Father. The same ambiguity that can be noticed in the biblical narrative resurfaces in the forms of communitarian Sufism, which take center stage in the ill-defined territory of popular Islam. Here, some pictures from Senegal. My colleagues were there just before the lockdown. On the one hand, monotheism is central to this experience and is indeed its very raison d'etre. On the other hand, however, popular Sufism was and is constantly exposed to the risk of falling into the realm of magic arts, of talismans, of spells, which turn religion into a kind of craftsmanship among the others. And here is a quotation from the Arab literature: how marvelous was the stupidity of the people, which I took advantage of with ease. I received from them the full measure of good, while I weighed out to them naught but fraud and falsehood. Here, the person speaking is Abul Fath al-Iskandari, a trickster, and he is playing the role of a devotee saint, and he is tricking all the people and making money out of them. In his 2018 apostolic exhortation, Gaudete et Exultate, Pope Francis famously spoke of a middle class of holiness. While the Pope is referring to holiness within the militant church, it is clear in the text, I believe that this qualification can be extended by way of analogy to include not only the Old Testament sons of the prophets, but also their Islamic counterparts. I am thinking in particular of some forms of popular Islamic devotions, which have nowadays come under attack from all kinds of reformists, from modernists to neo-Salafis, and these continue to be central to popular religiosity, especially in regions such as sub-Saharan Africa. More often than not, they are the messengers of hope for their peoples. This is the title of a beautiful book by Nelly Amri. In spite of their ambiguity, these Islamic guilds could thus also be assigned the patronage of Elisha, their first master, whose name, but only their name, occurs in the Quran too. He is indeed the archetype of the social prophet. Yet, from whence does Elisha derive his power? From the mantle of Elijah. Let us then move to the second station and its typos. Unlike Elisha, Elijah is the great solitary. In Sufi parlance, we might say that while Elisha shows the merits of subha, or companionship, Elijah is the champion of khalwa, or retreat. As everyone knows, this loftiest and most wonderful prophet of the Old Testament, I am quoting the Catholic Encyclopedia, emerges suddenly from the passages of the Bible. No genealogy is given. He has the power to appear and disappear at will. He has no family and leads a solitary life in the desert to escape persecution. His ordeal, the subsequent slaughtering of the priest of Baal on Mount Carmel, which is called in Arabic Jabal Mar Ilyas, Mount of Saint Elias, is one of the highlights of the Old Testament, echoed also in the Quran. Here again, like in the story of Jehu, zeal and violence go hand in hand, however bewildering this may be to our modern understanding. After the ordeal, Elijah ascends to Horeb, the Mount of God, stands before the Lord, renews the covenant as a new Moses. He experiences a theophany, which happens in a sound of sheer silence. A symbol of the prophetic intimacy with God, this silence contrasts with the thunders and earthquakes that shook Mount Sinai on the revelation of the law to Moses. Finally, before his mysterious disappearance, Elijah appoints Elisha as his successor and bequeaths him his mantle, a symbolic act which is also central in Sufi lineages, where this item is called khirka. In spite of his election, however, Elisha only obtains 2/3 of his master's spirit, and the sons of the prophets receive far less. The relationship between Elisha, and the sons of the prophets can indeed be envisaged not only from bottom to top, as we have done so far, phenomenologically, but also, and perhaps more aptly, top-down, spiritually. No doubt, Elijah, my Lord is Yah, is in the Old Testament the type of the souls consumed by their desire of God. Unable to remain within the bounds of sociality, they have to exit to perform their exodus or hijrah in order to purify their image of the divine. Running faster than the king's chariots, they leave behind the comfortable plains of middle-class holiness as they start to ascend the steep, arduous, and at times impassable mountain of divine presence. Here again, I believe that it is legitimate to establish, if not a direct parallel, at least an analogy between Elijah and the giants of Sufism, inflamed like the Jewish prophet with their zeal for the one God. In a famous essay, Louis Massignon has indeed shown the extent of the Elianic presence in both mystical and popular Islam. But before doing so, we have to introduce a new figure, or rather a metamorphosis of a figure. In fact, and apart from the scant Quranic narrative of the Surah 37, and indeed Elijah was among the messengers, when Ilyas Lamin al-Mursalin, Elijah in Islam is conflated with al-Khadir, the green, one of the main characters of Surah 18, the cave. I just resume quickly the story. In verses 59 to 82, Moses, after reaching the confluence of the two seas, encounters a mysterious figure, a servant of God, whose name is not revealed in the text, but who is identified in Islamic tradition as Al-Khadir. This servant is endowed with special mercy and knowledge proceeding from God, and Moses begs permission to follow him. On their way, Al-Khadir commits 3 seemingly wicked deeds. Each time, Moses asks for an explanation, thereby breaking the promise of not questioning his fellow traveler. After the 3rd time, Al-Khadir disappears, but not before giving Moses, and as the listener or readers, the desired explanation for his behavior. Now, impossible to summarize the Quranic narrative and the literature about it. I just will focus about 2 questions. The first one, who is Moses here? Some commentators, ill at ease with his subordinate position in the story, have claimed that he may be Musa ibn Misha, that is Manasseh, although there is no mention whatsoever of him in the Quran. But the majority of scholars identify the Moses in the Surah of the Cave with the prophet of the Israelites, based on 2 hadiths in which they are explicitly associated. But then, asks the hadith scholar Ibn Hajar, how can a prophet, Moses, be a follower of a non-prophet? In effect, continues Ibn Hajar, a group of Sufis are of the opinion that Al-Khadir is a wali. This key term in Sufism is used to designate a friend of God or a saint, plainly. This line of thought, argues Ibn Hajar, is a very dangerous one, though, because it downplays the status of prophecy. To support his point, he also quotes an heretic verse in this regard, which says, the position of prophecy is a little above the messenger, but below the wali, the saint. Despite the scruples of the jurists, Al-Khadir is indeed considered a wali by most Sufis, who turn to him for inspiration. And they consider wilaya, or walaya, which is the abstract quality of the wali, to be a legacy of prophecy and a mood of participation in it, as it was theorized in particular by Ibn Arabi, or they regard it as outright superior, a position which can be found especially in Shiism. Whatever the status of wilaya in respect to prophecy, the lesson that Sufis draw from this Quranic passage is that even Moses, the quintessential prophetic lawgiver, has to learn a different form of knowledge from his mysterious fellow traveler. This fellow traveler is also allowed to break the law for reasons that are revealed only at the end of the story. And this passage also highlights the relationship between master and disciple. Well, why is al-Khadir conflated with Elijah or Elijah conflated with al-Khadir? Because in Islamic tradition, both are considered to be immortal, not exactly immortal because they will die in the day of judgment, but they are granted a long life. And there are 4 immortal figures, 2 in heaven, Idris, Enoch, and Jesus, and 2 on earth, Khadir and Elijah. So they tend to act together. Here also in the previous image, they are praying together. The 2 persons in the circle in the middle with the halo, they are Elias and Al-Khadir praying together. If not the same person altogether, they are at least close friends, or as some traditions describe it, twin brothers. They fast together in Jerusalem. During Ramadan, they make the pilgrimage to Mecca together. And Massignon, in his aforementioned essay, has offered a fascinating outline of the presence of Elijah al-Khadir in Islamic religiosity in terms of places, feasts, and traditions, many of which are related to the aquatic realm, like in this image. According to the French Orientalist, even the great theologian al-Ghazali would have felt the fascination of Elijah when he decided to take the Gate of Mercy in Jerusalem as his residence during the retreat in which he composed his masterwork, The Revival of the Religious Sciences. By this move, al-Ghazali would have placed his endeavor under the patronage of Elijah al-Khadir, who is believed to live there, while at the same time refusing to follow any normal human sheikh. To sum up, Elias is to the saints what Gabriel is to the prophets, as the Egyptian Sufi Ali ibn Muhammad Wafa expressed in a very powerful way. He is the archetype of Wilaya. This was especially elaborated by Al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi, one of the first theoreticians of Wilaya and Sufism. He is persistent in Islamic popular religiosity. According to Massignon, Elijah is the universal spiritual director. And he plays also an eschatological role because, according to Muslim views, he delays the outbreak of the Day of Judgment by repairing the wall at the end of the war. So, I reach my provisional conclusion. Moving from the Bible and without any thought of Islamic matters, I came across the sons of the prophets. On the one hand, I was immediately struck by the phenomenological similarities they displayed with the Sufis, and at the same time, they took me by hand and led me to Elisha, and from Elisha to Elijah. From there, I started my journey again, this time from within the Islamic tradition, and without any particular focus on the Bible. I explored again the notion of Wali, which is the most evident point of departure, and again, I was redirected to Al-Khadir and his twin brother Elijah. The conclusion imposes itself. There exists a deep Elianic dimension in Islamic mysticism. While I don't claim in any way that this is the comprehensive answer to the question regarding the place of Islam in the history of salvation, I cannot but notice this Elianic strain of saintliness. I also observe, from a Christian point of view, that in the Old Testament, Elijah is not like any other prophet, as his life journey ends with his assumption into heaven, body and soul. Thus, he is allowed to break the natural laws of space-time and anticipate in his person the redemption of humanity brought about in the Paschal event, and which will be fully revealed in the final judgment. To me, then, it does not seem inconceivable to assume that this prophet, Wali, may continue operating in Islamic mysticism, especially considering the nature of his zealous monotheism. He might thus be counterbalancing the sway of Moses, the law, in the expectation of the moment when both his path and Moses will be transfigurated by the manifestation of Christ, as the disciples experienced on Mount Tabor. I will not develop the fact that Elijah experience, in my view, an ultimate perplexity about not the journey itself, but the goal of the journey. In this sense, this is only the second path, because he will have to confront Iblis, the devil, as a stumbling block in his ascension, and he might maybe rely on the gracious help of Mary and the realm of the spirit, but this will be left perhaps for next year. Remember, we are only halfway in the journey, but enough for today. Let us be content of the spiritual Elianic affinities between Christians and Muslims that I hope we may have encountered in this presentation. They call for further exploration, both in study and life. After all, here is the symbol of the Carmelite order. After all, both Muslims and Christians believe that Elijah is in some way still alive, whether in heaven as the Bible has it, or on earth as the Islamic tradition states. If he is alive, let us look for his traces in this world. They are hidden but real. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martino. Wonderful. We have then a few minutes for maybe 2 or 3 questions or comments. The floor is open. Don't hesitate to use the little icon that you can find under the participants tab to raise your hand. Or you can just unmute. If I don't recognize that, go ahead and speak. Renee, please. Yes.
Thank you, Martino, for a great presentation. I just wanted to make one comment, because we did this exercise with young Muslims, Christians, Baha'is, Druze in Jordan, where we went to visit one of the shrines of al-Khadr in Jordan, because we have 2 very important ones. And one of them is actually very interesting because it's in an Islamic town. And on the day of St. George, on the 6th of May, the entire town and the entire neighboring town, which is entirely Christian, go together to celebrate the day of St. George. And the tradition in Jordan is that all these followers of all these religions recognize St. George al-Khadr as St. George, not as St. Elias, and they go and ask for a miracle. And it's really interesting to listen to the oral tradition of all these people telling you about the miracles that happened to their children, to their families of al-Khadr. And the term al-Khadr, the green in Arabic, comes from different reasons. One of them is that they connect St. George to the season in the lands. So it's the good, the rain. If it's a rainy season, it's a good season to the land, etc. So al-Khadr. And then again, they kind of take a green ribbon from the shrine, and they put their promise on one of the trees, which is a very old tree. In the shrine that we visited, the tree was like 500 years old. So even the tree is sacred. So they used to like put the ribbon over there, and many of them would actually take a ribbon. That's why if you go in Jordan and see a green ribbon in the cars, everywhere it's from St. George or al-Khadr. So it's known for all the traditions. And we have even folkloric songs praying or asking for a favor of al-Khadr in Jordanian Arabic dialect as well. So it's really interesting to actually experience what you just explained in the day-to-day life in our lives as Muslims, Christians, and different other religions in Jordan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Renee. Absolutely, it's absolutely fascinating, and of course, the experience of Islamic popular religiosity in the Middle East. It's a great richness, and we all hope that it might continue, because there are also pressures to change things and to make things more scriptural in a way. So maybe next year I will come with you to the to the village. And yes, as you mentioned, I didn't mention it in the presentation, although there was an image. St. George al-Khadir is also associated to St. George, and so it plays an important role also for Christians, but I didn't mention that because I wanted to focus on Elijah, but yes, it is worth reflecting too.
Yes, Mun'im, please. Maybe this will be the last question.
Yes, yeah. Martino, thank you for the great presentation. You mentioned 2 stages of Sufi journey. I wonder whether the role of Elijah is different in each of the two stages that you just mentioned.
Yes, so I believe the first station, so to say, is a station of companionship, so the social aspect of prophecy, like, and it is under Elisha, so this disciple of Elijah, because but it's just a suggestion, you know. So there are many parts, of course, but these particular parts, in my opinion, starts with the social dimension, like the sons of the prophets. Then it moves from Sobha to Khalwa, and so from companionship to spiritual assis, and so from Elisha to Elijah. This you can also envisage it the other way around, like Elijah is the master and Elisha takes 2/3 of the spirit and then it passes it down to the sons of the prophets. This applies, in my opinion, by way of analogy at least, also to the Islamic tradition, where you have the 2 dimensions of the social saints and also the saints who practice retirement in the sake of the face of God.
Thank you so much, Martino. Well done.
Thank you.
We're going to turn now without delay to Professor Rehan Durmaz. I'll just have a brief introduction, and I think, Rehan, that Paul has already made you co-host, so you can go ahead if you have a PowerPoint and share the screen. Rehan is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She works on Syriac Christianity, Christian-Muslim relations in the Middle Ages, religion and society in late antiquity, hagiography, storytelling, and popular piety. We're really just so grateful that she is part of this project along with Martino and Mun'im today. Her first book project, tentatively titled Beyond Hagiography, Stories Between Christianity and Islam in the Middle Ages, examines the transmission of non-biblical saint stories and cults from Christianity to Islam. Her other research projects include the study of rural Christianities in the Middle Ages in the Eastern Mediterranean. And Professor Durmaz received her PhD from Brown in 2019, so quite recently, and won the Joukowsky Outstanding Dissertation Award in Humanities. Her presentation today is on Saint Anthony of Egypt between Christianity and Islam. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Gabriel, for that very generous introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. First of all, the generic question, can you all hear me? Good. So let me just start by sharing my slides. All right, so I will speak about the representation of Saint Anthony in a 9th century Islamic text, namely Kitab al-Wajal wa Tawattuq bil Amal, authored by the courtly moralist Ibn Abi al-Dunya. Through the example of this representation, I will speak about 3 literary tools used for the framing of sanctity in this text, namely the remembrance and legacy of Saint Anthony, the universal genealogy of holiness, and the role of intelligence in relation to piety and sanctity. And the text has been edited quite a while ago, and the only person who has worked on it so far was Franz Rosenthal, who published an English translation of the text in 1962. So first, I would like to say a few words about my relation to this text. As Gabrielle pointed out, this analysis is part of my broader project, tentatively titled Beyond Hagiography. In the book, I examine a number of extra-biblical stories that were transmitted between Christianity and Islam. While I analyze the dynamics facilitating these literary transmissions, in broader terms, I problematize the category of hagiography. Saint Anthony's story, let me just give you this back. Saint Anthony's story provides a great example through which one can capture some aspects of the Islamic understanding of sanctity in relation to Christian hagiography. I thought it would be an interesting case to present in this group, for it's an understudied text exemplifying the representations of holiness in a literary context that is not conventionally hagiographical, since the Wajal is technically a work of adab. All right, so the text opens with 6 reports from Muslim religious authorities. Here you see the list: Muslim bin Yasar, Al-Hasan al-Basri, Sa'id bin Zaid, Mutarrif bin Miqal, Sufyan bin Uyayna, and Wahab bin Nabbih. They all exhort the reader on doing one's best deeds in this world in order to avoid remorse in the next world. For example, here are 3 of them. The first report goes as Muslim bin Yasar says, he who hopes for something looks for it, and he who fears something flees from it. I don't know what good it does to a man to hope if he does not bravely suffer misfortunes that happen to him. And I don't know what good it does to a man to be afraid if he cannot leave alone desires that come to him. Similarly, Al-Hasan al-Basri says, there are people who are diverted by wishful thoughts of forgiveness until they leave this world without having a good deed to their credit. Such a person might say, I have a good opinion of my Lord. That, however, is a lie, for if he had had a good opinion of his Lord, he would have done good deeds. There are 4 more similar reports in the text, which highlight that feelings of hope, love, devotion, fear by themselves are not meaningful unless they are translated to acts of piety. And this is the main takeaway of the Wajal. Ibn Abi al-Dunya expands on this idea with the story of Saint Anthony. So after these, I'm not able to move, there we go. Yes, so after these 6 opening reports, Ibn Abi al-Dunya begins narrating the story of Saint Anthony. He says he is transmitting from an ancient book on wise sayings and parables attributed to Antunus as-Sa'ih. He first gives a framing story, and according to this story, King Atnaus, 320 years after the time of the Messiah, orders his dignitaries to select a new king, and the man asks the guidance of Saint Anthony, who lives in a cell in the desert. The rest of the story is a dialogue between these men and Anthony. In this dialogue, Anthony first exhorts his listeners on the frailty and temporariness of the world, emphasizing especially the dangers of hope in the absence of action. He says, it is strange, ajaban, that the ignorant and intelligent suffer in similar ways, because if you just keep hoping without doing anything, you will find the same misfortune as an unintelligent person. So this distinction between the al-jahil and then the al-alim is a continuous repeating theme in the text. Then Anthony describes his own ascetic practices. He points out that there are 4 gates on the body through which suffering enters the body. These are the mouth, eyes, nose, and the genitals. And he also exhorts on how one should abandon the bodily desires, as well as the other causes of suffering, such as politics, family, children, and wealth. So far, so good. After this exhortation on asceticism, Anthony narrates 9 parables to his audience. The parables are very generic, without any mention of personal or place names. Among these 9 parables, there is only one very vague mention of a place name. Otherwise, nothing is named. They are very, very generic. They are all stories about secular events. There is nothing about religion in these parables either. In every one of these parables, there is a man who puts himself in a dangerous situation despite the explicit warnings of other people about the dangers of that situation. The man proceeds in doing what he does, hoping for a positive outcome, but in the end, he either dies or brings harm upon himself. For example, in the first one, the companion of the snake, the man continuously receives a golden coin from a snake. People warn him against the dangers of this situation. he doesn't listen, then his family members end up being harmed by the snake. In the, let's say, for example, the story of the man of the dry riverbed, for example, the man starts dwelling in a dry riverbed, and people say it's a stupid idea, and he doesn't listen, and he gets flooded by. So in all of these events, there is a caricature of stupidity in a way. It's explicitly something that someone shouldn't do, and the person does, and there is harm brought upon it. So after narrating these events, Anthony concludes by quoting from the Quran. He doesn't mention the Quran, but he says, do you not know that the Torah brought by Musa, the Psalter brought by Dawood, the Gospel brought by the Messiah, and the books of all the prophets contain the following statement: you will be rewarded according to what you have done, which is a direct quotation from the Quran. So this is the structure of the text, in which Anthony is remembered to have lived in the 4th century during the reign of Athanas, which sounds like a remembrance of Athanasius, who was Saint Anthony's biographer. Anthony is remembered as an ascetic who retreated to the desert, who gave spiritual guidance to his visitors while he himself is fighting bodily needs. This characterization certainly captures the late antique dossier of Anthony in broad strokes. Although there is no close parallel between these stories in the Christian hagiographical text narrating Anthony, the Anthony in the Vajal is recognizably the Anthony de Didaskalos, the instructor in the Apophthegmata Patrum. But what does this characterization do for an Islamic audience? What aspects of holiness are highlighted in this new Islamic context of a renowned Christian holy man? There is, of course, much to say here, but I will highlight 2 aspects of holiness. First of all, I read this text as a universal conceptualization of sanctity, neither a simple hagiographical transmission nor a pseudepigraphical appropriation, which was the previous suggestion for this text. Anthony, with his parables, is expanding on the instructions of the Muslim religious authorities placed at the beginning of the text, not as an Islamicized Christian saint, but as the Anthony, the Saint Anthony of Egypt. He becomes a predecessor of Muslim holy men and a spokesperson for them. Anthony legitimates them by showing that they gave exhortations on the importance of pious deeds on which Anthony preached centuries ago. Integration of pre-Islamic prophets and saints into Islamic salvation history and defining them in Islamic hagiographical terms are, of course, well known. The Wajal participates in this broader practice while showing that Islamic sanctity was, in some contexts, defined through its proximity to a universal understanding of piety, which Christian and Muslim holy men preached alike. This universalism is in fact explicitly expressed in 2 places in the text. In the parable of the Christian and the Jew, for example, these 2 men are walking in the desert and they run out of water. It's again a very secular story. But in one sentence, Anthony says, this is not Ibn Abi al-Duya, Anthony says, Christian, Jew, and Muslim will perish similarly if you do not follow the scriptures. So they are all put together in the path of their scriptures. And at the end, the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scriptures are said to be delivering the same message with a quotation from the Quran, if you remember. Thus, universality is one of the major highlights of this text. Secondly, the text underlines the role of intelligence in Anthony's exhortation. Surely the holy man is portrayed as an ascetic man who retreats from the world. That aspect of sanctity gained as a result of humility and asceticism is present in the text. But both Anthony and the 6 Muslim authorities cited at the beginning of the text preach on the role of intelligence in piety. Salvation and damnation, according to the Vajal, depend on the use and misuse of intelligence. Anthony ends every parable with a statement like these ones. I marvel at those, with the word ajaba, I marvel at those intelligent people who know the moral to be derived from such parables, but do not make use of their knowledge. I marvel at the man who amasses property to his own detriment and prefers others to himself. I marvel at such preoccupation with hope and greed, which deceives intelligent and stupid people alike. Again, back to that distinction, until they perish together. So this highlight of intelligence and how one must utilize and mobilize their thoughts and knowledge in order to find out the truth for themselves is the second highlight of the text, which I thought would be interesting to talk about in this paper. So I will leave you with that, and I look forward to talking about the text more with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful, great, and we have some time for conversation. Maybe I'll take advantage of my role as moderator to ask the first question. I wanted to ask generally about the positive assessment in certain early Islamic texts, like Ibn Abi Dunya, but not only that text, maybe generally in Kitab, books about Zuhd, about asceticism, of the Rahib, especially because, as you know, no doubt, there's the passage in, I think it's sort of 57, towards maybe at the very end of 57, which speaks about the innovation of Rahbaniyya. The innovation of monasticism, presumably in a critical way, though I think it's a complicated verse. But yeah, if you could speak about that. I think there are even some figures among the companions, or maybe the successors, Muslims who won the nickname Rahib, monk, because of their piety. So yeah, any thoughts you have on that?
Right, thank you so much for that. I'm still struggling with that distinction. The Rahib that or the monks and holy men whose stories have been transmitted to Islam from Christianity, and then the monk or the Rahib whose story originated in Islamic literature as an imagination of the Rahbaniyya and the Rahib. And I see a distinction between these two categories. In, for example, many stories where the stories of holy men are transmitted to Islam from Christianity, and we can trace the story back to Syriac or a Greek earlier version, I see that the title is actually erased many times. They are referred to as either, kana rajulan mujtahidan zahidan, a very ascetic man, but they are not rahib. Or they are, in this case of Anthony, for example, they are a sa'ih, but not a monk. But as you mentioned, there is a huge corpus of Islamic imagination and literature on the rahib as this wise person, as a venerable person. And sometimes that's a nostalgic, that's a romanticized version. Sometimes it's closer to what we know, what monks were in late antiquity. So that's me thinking out loud about these two different literary depictions of the monk in Islam. And you're right that there is a positive, there are quite a number of positive depictions of Rahbaniyya and monks in Islam, but I still have to see one example of the story, the actual story of a monk or a holy man transmitted to Islam, keeping those titles, those clerical or Christian titles. Mm-hmm. But there is, of course, just so much to say. It almost varies from text to text, so we can maybe bring more text into the discussion to give nuance to these different depictions. Even in this text, although Anthony is, of course, highly venerated, he's among the companions and the followers, right? Like he's almost one of the Muslim saints. But that story, there is a story in this text, a parable about somebody who poses as a monk because he had a grandiose beard, and he could he could actually fool a group of monks because they fell for that beard and they started venerating venerating this man. And he even misinterpreted the scriptures. He was sinning all the time, but nobody realized this because he had this beard. So there is a caricaturization and satirization of monasticism in this very text. So all I will say shortly is that this is really very complicated, and I can't really point to a time period where there was positive attitudes towards Rahbaniya and then it turned in another direction. I think it is really text-based.
Thank you so much.
Hello?
Yes, Professor Odozor, yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I just wanted a clarification. You mentioned there are two categories of saints. Some of, of monks, holy people transmitted, as it were. I didn't get the language from Christianity into Islam. And then you argue, or you state that when they are transplanted, they lose their they lose whatever it was that they're not equated, or they don't have the same standing as the community-grown saints of the Islamic community. Am I right? What do you mean by what do they lose exactly? What is it that makes them lose whatever it is?
Thank you. So that's been my observation, that in every case study that I work on, I have some of these Syriac or Greek stories, and their stories, these stories of these holy men who were either bishops or monks or other categories of sanctity in Christianity. Their stories get transmitted to Islam, and they lose those titles in that process. Of course, I can't point
just a sec.
the
They
title.
lose the title of whatever, whether they were bishop or
Exactly.
Okay, clerics in Christianity. Okay.
Exactly. For example, there is a story. It was written in Edessa. Talks about an Edessan bishop and a deacon, Bishop John and his Bishop Paul and his companion John. That's not a very well-known story, but they travel to South Arabia, and one of them is a bishop, the other one is a deacon. So they have those titles throughout the Christian story, and we see a rephrasing of that story in Islamic literature, which appears in the Sirah of Muhammad, Fimyun and Saleh, and the story keeps being transmitted until the 13th century. So for some reason, it was a very popular story across multiple genres of Islamic literature. But in none of them we read about their clerical titles. They are just rajula, they are just ascetic men. So I observed that when, in such cases, when the story is transmitted from Christianity, the titles are lost on the way. But of course, there are monks that are mentioned in Islamic literature. But my observation is that those stories were written in Islamic literature by Muslim authors. They do not generally go back to an actual story of a monk or a bishop or a churchman in Christianity. Bahira, for example, we don't know a pre-Islamic story of Bahira. He becomes a Christian saintly figure after, based on the Islamic story, but there is no Rahib Bahira in pre-Islamic Christian literature. So I wanted to distinguish between those transmitted saints versus the saints whose story originated in Islam, the Christian saints whose story originated in Islam.
Thank you very much.
I really hope it makes sense. I really am hoping it makes sense.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
We have time for one more question, maybe two. Yes, Paul.
Thanks so much, Rehan. I'm interested in any kind of insights you have about why some Christian saints become appealing to Muslims at certain times and not others. one thing that I'm struck by in terms of Anthony is that he was a holy person in Egypt, which quickly became an Islamic place. And I'm just wondering the extent to which the attraction of a Christian saint for Islamic piety grew if their deeds were done in a place that became Islamic in the period of Islamic expansion.
But I think geography definitely plays a role. But when I try to build a frame as to what Christian saints are doing in Islamic literature, there is all kinds of purposes, all kinds of goals their stories were oriented towards. One of them is etiology, to use their stories as to explain earlier histories and to explain some of the Islamic practices and notions. The other one is simply historiography. The other one is just like the story of Anthony, to define to define Islamic sanctity through the lens of Christian sanctity, and we can cite a couple more. And as to why Anthony and not someone else, maybe we can partly explain it with the fact that Anthony is the great Anthony, right? Like, he never ends being an important person. So of course, everybody wants a piece of Anthony. But it's really interesting to see why some other saints were not transmitted to Islam, although they were in the heartlands of Islamic world. Simeon the Stylite. Where is Simeon the Stylite? There is only one short passage in a local historiographical text, and it's incorrect historically, and it's only like literally 2 sentences. Other than that, where is Simeon? Why was he not venerated by Muslims? I'm sure he was in popular piety, but why do we not see that in literature? I'm not sure. So it is a very big, the why part is a very big question. And you're right that I think geographical expansion facilitated that, but it doesn't always explain the why question. Yeah.
I was going to add an anecdote very briefly, which you can comment on or not. In a text written about the year 1000, the Iranian author Abdul Jabbar, the Mu'tazili, the work is Tathbit Dalail al-Nubuwah. He has a whole section with stories of monks, which he caricatures. So he does it in a sort of hostile way. So a completely different take on monks. And they're the sort of stories that you find, I think, in literature like the Pratum Spirituale of John Moskos and the early apophthegmata, tough word to say, literature. So stories like, for example, the monks, when they get together, they tell themselves stories like the guy who was taken, the monk who was taken by a pagan king and imprisoned, but miraculously showed up back in his monastic cell and was taken again and was killed and cut up in pieces, but miraculously turned back in his monastic cell. But even the monks don't really believe these stories. They laugh at them. And so Christianity has no firm basis. So he seems to make fun of the way they use it as sort of, I don't know, arguments for Christianity, but very weak arguments.
Yeah, no, I actually made a note of it. That's an excellent example that shows us that there is no homogeneous attitude towards monks. And it's really interesting how each author just takes a different stand. But I think these are more frequent. These mockery of monks are maybe more accurate and more frequent than the monk that is idealized and venerated. But yeah, no, I think we have to be very specific in terms of geography and literary genre and author's own context, instead of trying to find out overarching attitudes towards one aspect of Christianity. It's my 2 cents.
Great, thank you so much, Reyhan.
Thank you.
Okay, and we're turned now to our 3rd and final presentation. It's I'm really grateful for everyone for being here on a Friday afternoon or evening or early morning if you're in Australia. Saturday, I guess, early morning, I think. It's a pleasure, a real genuine pleasure to introduce a friend and colleague, Professor Mun'im Sirry, who's assistant professor in world religions, world church here at Notre Dame in the Department of Theology. He works on many things, Quranic studies and interreligious relations, but is a real authority on topics such as Islamic law and theology as well, both classical and contemporary, also on tafsir, exegesis. His publications include a terrific book entitled Scriptural Polemics that was published by Oxford University Press in 2014, and many, many articles. I'll just name two: What Makes Modern Tafsir Modern, a closer look at Hamka's Tafsir al-Azhar and Indonesian exegesis, commentary on Quran, and that was published in 2016. In that same year, he published Reinterpreting the Quranic Criticism of Other Religions, which is part of a collected volume edited by Angelica Neuwirth and Michael Sells, who I think was also his doctrinal slip of the tongue. We're speaking about doctrine, I guess, doctoral advisor. And he's going to speak to us today on the ascetic Jesus in early Islam, defining piety in the Kitab al-Zuhd genre. So thank you for being with us, Mun'im, and you should have the authority to turn on your PowerPoint there that Paul gave to you. So thank you. Just don't forget to unmute.
Okay, sorry. So I hope my talk will be a continuation of the discussion generated by Rehan presentation. Let me share my PowerPoint here. So do you see it?
Yes.
Okay. My paper examined the work of early Muslim ascetic, particularly those who wrote a book under the title Kitab al-Zuhd, or Book on Renunciation. In the 8th and 9th centuries, or 2nd and 3rd of Islamic era, we witnessed the proliferation of Muslim writings on asceticism. At least there are 9 books with the title Kitab al-Zuhd that are extant today. It is in this ascetic discourse that we find extensive references to the Christian traditions, which suggest that the Muslim sainthood emerged within the Christian environment or due to interaction with Christian ascetic. When you look for a Christian antecedent of in Islamic spirituality, it is the doctrine and practice of monastic life which are most striking. The Quran makes it possible to show sympathy for Christian monasticism. When preaching to Christians as the closest among people in affection to the believers, the Quran says that is because some of them are priests and monks and they are not arrogant. Of course, there are also attacks on Christians, notably for taking their monks as a Lord. In one striking expression, the Quran says, when referring to Jesus, this is the verse that Gabriel referred earlier, and we meet at the heart of those who follow him, kindness and mercy and monasticism or ruhbaniyah. The Swedish scholar Tor Andre described the spiritual fellowship between Christians and Muslims as follows. The sense of spiritual affinity with Christianity, or rather with that form of Christianity that was regarded as original and orthodox, is also expressed in the dominant position Jesus occupied in the pronouncement and ideas of the ascetic. The prophets most often named and quoted in pious legend and sayings are Jesus, Moses, David, John the Baptist, in that order. Jesus is without comparison placed first among the four. Following the lead as identified by Tor Andre, I examined how Jesus is presented in Kitab al-Zuhd written by early Muslims. Given the numerous sources which are not manageable for such presentation, I focus only on the work of Ibn Mubarak, one of the first to write this genre of Zuhd, and Ibn Hambal, who lived in the middle of the 9th century. Their books follow different pattern. One is thematic and the other biographical, which I will say more in a moment. The argument I would like to make is that while the influence of Christianity on Islamic asceticism is not a controversial issue, early Muslims did not simply duplicate the Christian monastic life. It is true that Jesus is seen as an example of piety and sainthood, but he is also presented in Kitab al-Zuhd to fit into an Islamic milieu. There is no question that Jesus occupied special status among early Muslims. In Ibn Mubarak's work, for instance, we find 16 statements attributed to Jesus compared to 9 statements attributed to Luqman the Wise, 5 to each David and Moses, 2 statements to John the Baptist, and 1 to Solomon. Let me say a few things about Ibn Mubarak and Ibn Hambal just briefly. In his biographical dictionary, the medieval Muslim scholar al-Dhahabi described Ibn Mubarak as the exemplar of ascetic and their leaders. Pioneering in the field of hadith, Ibn Mubarak is best known for his Kitab al-Zuhd. He was born in Marwa to a wealthy family. His father was a successful merchant. The sources seem to agree in describing Ibn Mubarak's extensive travel in pursuit of knowledge. He must have been financially well off to cover the cost of his travel. Ibn Mubarak was certainly rich ascetic. He was asked by Fudail bin Iyad, "You command us to practice Zuhd, possess little, and have restraint, and yet you come with merchandise. How is it?" He responded saying, "O Abu Ali, I do this to maintain my dignity, protect my honor, and be assessed through it to worship my Lord." When he was asked to define al-Zuhd or renunciation, Ibn Mubarak says, "It is having trust in God while loving poverty." This loving poverty should be understood not a desire for the world, even though one might be as wealthy as he was. In this sense, Zuhd is about certain attitude rather than physical quality of not having wealth. His Kitab al-Zuhd expands aspects of piety that emphasize the sincerity of the heart in the realm of both faith and practice. Divided into several topics, the book begins with a chapter on worship by reminding the reader of the limited amount of time which human beings have to live, and hence framing the rest of the book as a work that describes and calls for various forms of piety. He then deals with issues that are crucial for the formation of Islamic piety, such as the fear of consequences of sin, sadness and lament, guarding the tongue, humility, and so forth. In each of these topics, Ibn Mubarak includes statements attributed to the Prophet Muhammad and previous prophets, his companions and successors. And the statement of Jesus are scattered throughout the books. Ibn Hambal organized his book somehow differently. He is best known for his collection of hadith entitled al-Musnad, although he is also the founder of Hanbali legal school. Without doubt, Ibn Hambal is the central defining figure of Sunnism in early 9th century. His resistance to the attempt of the Abbasid Caliph to impose rationalist doctrine makes him a folk hero and shaped the trajectory of Sunni Islam. His piety is adorned by his followers to the extent that many miracles or karamat have been attributed to him. Like Ibn Mubarak, Ibn Hambal was also a wealthy saint. He owned a number of rental properties that supply enough income to support him and his family. Michael Cooperson from UCLA, who translated Ibn al-Jawzi's biography of Ibn Hambal, says, I quote, "If he is saint, Ibn Hambal is not only man of God, but also husband, father, and landlord, possibly the only saintly landlord in literature," end quote. His Kitab al-Zuhd, according to Christoph Melchert, is one of the largest extant collection of renunciant saying from the first 3 centuries of Islam. Melchert writes, I quote, "To my knowledge, the next largest extant collection after al-Zuhd of Ahmad bin Hanbal is Kitab al-Zuhd wa Raqa'iq, attributed to Ibn Mubarak, which comprise altogether around 2,050 items," end quote. So I'm dealing with the 2 largest works on Zuhd, which were produced in the first centuries of Islam. Unlike Ibn Mubarak, who arranged his book topically reflecting various forms of piety, Ibn Hambal organized his book biographically and mostly chronologically, and appeared to be modeling the biographical dictionaries that was beginning to be prevalent by his time. Ibn Hambal's book begins with a chapter on the Prophet Muhammad, depicting various anecdotes and reports associated to him. It then proceeds chronologically from Adam onward to Jesus. It is quite surprising that about 1/5 of the book comprise items from prophets before Muhammad. It is far more than any other such collection of renunciant saying. For instance, he spent more than 20 pages for the Jesus saying alone. Milcher conclude, I quote, "It is unusually rich in quotation of prophets before Muhammad. Scholars are still at an early stage of figuring out how to interpret it," end quote. Now, I will attempt to figure out how Jesus had been presented by Ibn Mubarak and Ibn Hambal. There is a gap of nearly 60 years between the two authors. Of the 16 sayings of Jesus found in Ibn Mubarak, only 6 sayings find their way into Ibn Hambal's book. Closer look at the two texts suggests that the former is not the source of the latter. This is evident from the fact that sometimes Ibn Hambal cites Jesus' sayings from different sources, or the wording of the same saying is different. Now, let me discuss examples of Jesus' saying that point to the nature of Zuhd, ascetic attitude and practice, as well as the relation of Zuhd to power and knowledge. What is Zuhd? Scholars in the past and present has defined Zuhd differently. Whether it is understood in its generic or specific meanings, the substance of Zuhd is related to the detachment or abstaining from the world. When Ibn Mubarak defines Zuhd as trust in God together with love of poverty, he referred to the exhortation of Jesus as follows: "Take mosques to be your homes, houses to be the stopping place, eat from the plants of the wilderness and escape from this world in peace." Another saying of Jesus cited by Ibn Mubarak is to show that the desire for this world, the love of possession, earthly joy, and bodily pleasure have to be restricted so that they do not intrude between the pious and God. Jesus says, "Strive for the sake of God, not for the sake of your bellies." Look at the bird coming and going. They need the rib of not flow, and God provides for them. If you see that the bellies of our bellies is larger than the bellies of the bird, then look at this cattle, wild and tame. As they come and go, neither reaping and nor plowing, and God provides for them too. Beware of the excess of the world, for the excess of the world is an abomination in God's eyes. Ibn Hambal mentions several sayings that reflect Jesus' view on Zuhd. For instance, all disciples, do not seek the world by destroying yourself. Seek your salvation by abandoning what is in the world. When asked about who one should be friends with, Jesus responded saying, "Be friend with someone who can increase your good deed, whose view remind you of God, and whose deed turn you away from your world." Another statement of Jesus seemed to reflect a different context in which Jesus referred to the world as the root of all sin. Worldly wealth is the great sins. And Jesus also said that the cultivation of wealth distracts men from the remembrance of God. Now, the nature of Zuhd. Recent studies on Zuhd tend to pay attention to diverse expression of Islamic asceticism, which suggests that Zuhd can take many forms. Whether Zuhd is understood as an extreme asceticism or mere sober and moderate sense of piety, there are certain qualities that pious people must have. Ibn Mubarak does not present Jesus as an example of extreme asceticism, but simply as a renouncer of worldly delights. His characterization of Jesus seems to reflect his aspiration for a vast array of positive characteristics that he regards important elements of Islamic piety. Ibn Mubarak narrates Jesus saying as follows: there are four qualities which are not found in one person without causing wonder. Silence, which is the beginning of worship, humility before God, an ascetic attitude toward the world, and poverty. Under the heading Sadness and Lament, or Huzn wa Buka, Ibn Mubarak narrates two sayings that can be found in Ibn Hambal as well, which point to the essential ascetic qualities, such as guarding the tongue, or not to examine the sins of people as though you are Lord, but rather examine people as though you are servant. The second part of this saying reflects another important elements of ascetic life, namely humility, which can be understood in different ways. According to Ibn Hambal, when Jesus was asked what is the best of worship, his answer was humility before God. It is also reported by Ibn Hambal that God revealed to Jesus, "Oh Jesus, admonish yourself, after then you can admonish other people." These reports suggest how important it is to correct oneself before correcting others. Looking at one's own mistake, yield to the truth as it reflects humility before God and awareness of one's lowliness and modesty. Another characteristic of Zuhd is sincerity or ikhlas in doing goodness. Sincerity is to give one's obedience with firm intention exclusively to the truth, that is doing good deed to bring one closer to God and not to impress others or to acquire good reputation in society. Ibn Mubarak relates Jesus' statement as follows: "O son of Adam, if you do good deed, try to forget it, for it abide with him who will not forget it." For his part, Ibn Hambal narrates several reports to the effect that Jesus offered his view of the nature of sincere life, both in theory and practice. For instance, when he was asked by his disciple, "Who is the sincere person?" his response was, "He is the one who acts for God and does not love to be praised by others." Several sayings of Jesus reflect sincere acts, some of which are reworking from the Bible, such as fasting and charity. Ascetic attitude. The kind of asceticism envisioned by Ibn Mubarak and Ibn Hambal is not the category of extreme asceticism that abandons social life. Both describe the ascetic teaching of Jesus not as complete detachment from the world. Rather, Jesus is presented as advocating for involvement in the world without being worldly. I'll skip this. Here, Jesus teaches how to interact with those who are in charge with authorities, both secular and religious. Attitude toward political authorities. Political leaders have been the target of Jesus' criticism. Both Ibn Mubarak and Ibn Hambal narrate saying of Jesus to his disciple, "Just as kings have left wisdom to you, you should leave the world to them." This reworking of render to Caesar commandment is understood by Tariq Khalidi as representing a particular faction in intra-Muslim polemics, namely Murjahid, who usually supported the rulers. However, asceticism emerged in one way or another as critical responses to the institutionalization of Islam by emphasizing spiritual integrity and transformation in contrast to authoritative discourse tied to political power. It is more likely that this early Muslim ascetic found a stock of the Jesus saying to support their hostile attitude toward political leaders, as reflected in the following statement: "A ruler should not be fancious, since it is to him that mankind look for refuge, nor should he be tyrannical, since it is from him that mankind demand justice." Interestingly, that the ascetic Jesus seemed to engage in real political life in the early Islamic history. It was revealed to Jesus, I quote, "A land is cursed if its rulers are young boys." Perhaps this is reworking of Ecclesiastes 10, "Woe to you, land, when your king is child." However, it is not difficult to speculate its context in the earliest crisis involving the succession of minor in Islamic history. When Yazid bin Muawiyah died, his son Muawiyah II, who was only 19 years old and ruled for the shortest period of time, namely less than 4 months. It is unclear how Muawiyah II died. Following his death, the Umayyad power temporarily collapsed until Marwan, distant uncle, took control. That crisis was the immediate prelude to the second civil war in Islamic history. Here you see that Jesus commented on the divisive conflicts in the early Islamic political landscape. Attitude toward empire scholars, my last point. Religious scholars or ulama acquire high status, but when they were so preoccupied with worldly matters, they become the target of ascetic criticism as well. Ibn Hambal spent a great deal of time narrating Jesus, who questioned the people of knowledge, or Ahlul Ilm, whose concern was with this world. The Islamic Jesus says, I quote, "How come one belong to the people of knowledge if his world is more important than he is hereafter?" And he continues, says, how could one be among the people of knowledge if he seek kalam, or Muslim speculative theology, in order to talk and not to act? Too much knowledge only increases pride, says, Jesus says, if you do not act in according with it. Thus, we find Jesus praise someone who read the book of God and follows what is in it. Interestingly, we can also find, Jesus referred to the Quran itself, saying, "Blessed is he who read the Quran and act accordingly." It is not unnatural to find Jesus' reference to the Muslim scripture, since he is presented in an Islamic milieu. Another criticism against the impious scholars can be found in Ibn Mubarak's report, when Jesus was asked, "O Spirit and the Word of God, who is the most sidious of men?" He responded, "The scholar who is in error. If scholar err, the host of people will fall into error because of him." And those scholars were called by Jesus as ulama usu, or evil religious scholars, when he says yahkum ulama usu, meaning false scholars give judgment. At the time when this Jesus saying was circulated, scholars were courted by the Abbasid Caliph in their attempt to establish basis of support for their dynasty. Perhaps these Jesus sayings reflect a common attitude among Muslims who oppose those who serve the state by putting their religious knowledge and social prestige too eagerly at its disposal. Conclusion. So the depiction of Jesus in the Muslim mystical literature reflect unique record of how early Muslims choose to adopt the central figure of Christianity and recognize him as a constitutive of their own pious identity. Of particular interest here is how Muslims appropriate various sayings and stories attributed to Jesus in a way that is distinctively Islamic. The question of where this saying and stories came from is beyond the scope of my talk. Some of the saying of Jesus are echoes or reworking of the Bible, and others seem to have their root in broader context. Both types of the Jesus sayings must have been in circulation at the beginning of Muslim asceticism. It is worth noting that Jesus is presented as a model of paramount piety without practicing austere self-denial. This is in contrast to the ascetic practice prevalent in the early Islamic periods among Christian monks and some Muslims influenced by this paradigm of piety. The Kitab al-Zuhd emphasized moral ethical character of Jesus, such as religious scrupulousness, humility, sincerity, and the courage to tell the truth before the oppressive political leaders and early religious scholars. And this image of an assertive ascetic is envisioned by Ibn Mubarak and Ibn Hambal as an ideal form of piety to be emulated by Muslim ascetic. Or perhaps those sayings simply reflect the nature of ascetic life in the first few centuries of Islam. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mun'im. Friends, the floor is open.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, I'm not able to raise virtually my hand, but
no problem. No problem.
So thank you, Mun'im, for this fascinating presentation. And I would ask you if you can elaborate more, a little about the fortune and fate of Zuhd literature, of ascetic literature, because in the first centuries, there is a big flourishing. You mentioned, I mean, people so important as Ibn Hambal, and it is a kind of ethical literature, really also offering great spiritual benefit. Then it looks like it is partly incorporated into Sufi literature and it becomes more doctrinal. Would you agree with this, or is the fate of Zuhd literature different in Islamic thought?
Yeah, I would agree with that. That the Zuhd literature or asceticism, prelude the emergence of Sufism. So, so in the first centuries, some scholars argue that the most prevalent among Muslim scholars at the time was a type of ascetic life. It is only after 4th centuries of Islamic era that Muslim begins to emphasize more mystical aspect, more type of Sufism. But before then, the more prevalent was a type of unethical or more moral examples of life. It's more emphasis on ethical life rather than some sort of like philosophical or mystical readings or mystical understanding of religion.
Thank you.
Yes, Brad.
Yes,
please.
Brad.
Don't forget to unmute.
Can you unmute?
Mun'im, this is really a fantastic presentation. Thank you for it. You surprised me right now in your last remark. So, so how would you fit Rabia? I don't know how to pronounce your name properly. You gave two different kinds of asceticism. One is more ethical and the other one more mystical. I would have placed her in both those categories. How do you see her? Kind of getting off track here, but just real quick.
Well, yes, I would argue that there are some overlaps, of course, between asceticism and Sufism. Although Rabia, lived much later, in the Islamic periods. Her mystical understanding is about how to love a God. So one of the most often quoted statement from her is that we should obey God not because we fear punishment or we expect a reward, but rather it is simply because of our love for God. So so yes, I think that that Rabia can represent both pietistic life as well as mystical, because we cannot draw clear line between asceticism and mysticism, right? There are some overlaps between the two stream of thought.
Thank you, Mun'im.
Yeah, I think we have time for one last question, and Minlib contacted me by text, and so I'm going to turn to him.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Do you see a continuity between Ibn Hambal, as you presented, understanding of Jesus, and what Rumi and Ibn Arabi are doing later?
Well, when I'm thinking of Ibn Arabi, I'm thinking of his Fusus al-Hikam, which I read a long time ago, when he enumerate the wisdoms of all prophets, you know, from Adam to Jesus, and I think Ahmad bin Hanbal, a type of asceticism is somehow different from Ibn Arabi, because Ibn Hanbal seemed to emphasize the ethical ascetic life rather than philosophical, as Ibn Arabi tend to promote. I don't know if you agree with that.
Of course, Ibn Hambal is not Ibn Arabi. Of course, that's you know, I agree. Yeah, I was just thinking if because what I see in Rumi and Ibn Arabi reading of is more of what I can call the mystical Christology of Islam. You know, in the sense that in which way Jesus is regarded as one might say the exemplar of the Sufi, exemplar of the mystical life. Is what those two are capitalizing on. That's really what you know. I was a good. That's really what I was asking. If there is a continuity between what Ibn Hanbal is doing in terms of Zuhd to the transition of the Sufi tradition, right?
What I found interesting, you know, in this Zuhd literature is that yes, Jesus is a Muslim prophet, but he also retained, you know, an identity which is not in congruence with what we find in the gospel. So as you can see from some examples that there are you know, Jesus sayings that seem to have parallels in the gospel, or someone might call it as that those statements have you know gospel core. But of course, you know, those gospel cores have been Islamized, you know, to make it or to acquire some Islamic stem, which is quite distinctive.
All right, thanks.
Thank you for all the questions. Thank you so much to Martino, Reyhan, and Mun'im for a wonderful session that I think there was harmony between the three topics, and thanks to everyone, to Paul, who's working on this project with me, to all of you for your conversation. Please come back next week. We look forward to seeing you on September 25, which will be a second session on saintliness in Islam. I'll be speaking, and then Professors Naila Tabara will join us from Beirut, and Murad Takawi. And otherwise, have a good week, and we look forward to the continuation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.